Okay, we're going to go ahead and start and just hope that more people come. I really appreciate the ones of you who've shown up tonight. And I'm sorry for those that had to drive around looking for the place with 4th Street on the notice that I sent out. That was a huge mistake. I wanted to start by saying that this is the first time in all the years that CSPP has been in existence, and that's since 2011, this is the first time I've heard a group of elected officials in Marin County come right out with a report that states that we have a problem and that we have to deal with it. So I want to thank the Marin, this is a tough one, Marin County Council of Mayors and Council Members for doing this. Then I want to thank Larry Chu, who's the Vice Mayor of Larkspur, and John McCauley, who's the council member in Mill Valley, for agreeing to speak tonight and to answer your questions. And thanks to Dick Spotswood, who's our forever moderator for everything we do. And lastly, I want to thank John Gamblin, who made it possible for us to have this room tonight. And now we'll start the meeting and hope more people show up.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dick Spotswood, and it's a pleasure to be here to kind of coordinate this event, which has already really been done brilliantly by Jody and the folks at the Citizens for Sustainable Pension Plans. You are the elite tonight that follow government with some intensity and play an extraordinary and outside role because, frankly, most people presume things are going okay and they lead their normal lives. And so folks that come to events like this and pay attention and read reports like that have been prepared tend to have an outside influence when they actually contact council members or county supervisors and urge that something be done to resolve longstanding problems that can have disastrous implications for the people of Marin County. For years, people led by Jody and the group have been pointing out that this county, along with most other California counties, have a disastrous situation in the long term to make their pensions sustainable. We know that if the pensions aren't sustainable, they will be paid, but something's going to go somewhere else. Your taxes are going to go up. You're going to have less services, which is usually what happens, or potentially, if there's another economic downturn, disaster for everyone. So tonight, it's a pleasure to say that the MCCMC, the Marin County Council of Mayors and Councilmen, took the extraordinary step of authorizing some of their members to prepare the Marin County Local Government Reform of Pensions and Other Employment Benefits. They're reminding you of something in that title that I often forget when I write about it in the paper, and that is it's not just pensions. It's the unsustainable other pension benefits, including medical health insurance, that cause part of the problem. And so it's easy to forget that because pensions is a cliche. It all is just pensions, but it's a two-part operation. And the people who have prepared this report are another reason why council members tend to be perhaps more attuned to the problem. They're not full-time politicians. They're real-life people that have real-life jobs. And hopefully they bring some expertise to the table. I'm going to introduce two of them tonight. We're going to start with John McCauley. I'll introduce them separately. But listen to McCauley's biography, and you'll understand why a council member might be in a better position than a county supervisor to analyze something as complicated as this. John McCauley is a retired certified public accountant and former partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He was responsible for issuing auditing opinions on large clients in the financial service industry, which included dealing with technical pension issues. He managed the San Francisco audit practice for many years and was responsible for their local profit and loss, including budgeting, hiring, firing, and compensation matters, and guiding PriceCooper local corporate culture. John served on the Mill Valley Planning Commission for 2 terms and is now in his 2nd term on the City Council of the City of Mill Valley. He has served as mayor of the City of Mill Valley. He teaches a class in financial services each fall at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. It's really a pleasure to introduce one of the best councilmen in the county, along with Larry Chu, John McCauley.
When I'm done. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so, and I'm going to go into professor mode, and I have a little lecture for you, okay? And then at the end of that time, we'll have a much broader conversation. In lecture mode, what I like to suggest is just like in my classroom, if I say something and you don't quite understand it and you've got a short question, just sing out and ask me, and we can talk about it. Now, if you want to get into a deep conversation about a point I just made, hold that, because once the first period is complete, we're going to have plenty of time for a broader conversation. So that's how I'd like to operate if I could. One other thing, I get excited sometimes, particularly about numbers, and when I should go slow, I tend to go a little bit faster. So if I start to sound like I'm an auctioneer down in Texas or whatever, raise your hands, and that will signal to me, especially my wife will help me out on this, that I might be going a little too fast, okay? And with that, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Oh, one more thing. For some reason, people who deal with money have to wear suits. You know, so if you go to one of the malls here in Marin and you see somebody walking around with a suit on, you know they work for Schwab or Morgan Stanley or whatever. Those are the only people who wear suits. So I thought tonight I should probably wear a suit, and I let Larry know. He wasn't really happy about the idea, but he said he'd bring one. And I was thinking about it. The only time I normally wear suits anymore is at weddings and funerals. So after this presentation, you can take a minute and say, okay, based on what I've said, is the information and the finality of what I've talked about remind you more of a funeral? Or maybe because I'm talking about things that the cities can do, recognizing this problem, it might feel like the optimism of a wedding. So you can decide that yourselves. All right. That's all the humor I've got tonight because I am an accountant and that's all I'm allowed to have. Okay, so this report which we put together was an update of a 2011 report that Larry really drove. I wasn't on councils at that time. And 2011 was when Pepper was first coming out, and people were really trying to understand what was going on. And Larry did a great job of putting the first report together, but it focused principally on pensions. It didn't focus on other post-employment benefits, OPEBs as we call them, which is basically retiree health care. And as Dick pointed out, it's a very big number also, and it has an equal amount of importance. And I'll get into some of the details in a minute, but this report covers both of those items. Okay, so let's get the slides going. Good. Okay, you're a pretty knowledgeable group, so I'm going to go through these things fairly quickly. As you know, cities in Marin provide 2 post-employment benefits to their employees. A pension benefit from either CalPERS or MCERA, if you're someone from San Rafael, or a city-specific other post-employment benefits, OPEB. We just rattled that word off, OPEB, like it's quick, but what it really represents mostly is medical coverage after you retire. Okay. So what's going on in Marin? We currently, as you can see on the slide, have a combined total liability for Marin cities exceeding $401 million. Now, I don't know about you guys, but it's hard for me to absorb that number. What does that mean? I'll give you some practical description of what it actually means in a later slide, but start with that thought of 401 million. So how do we get there? Well, the stock market was high, and there was a decision to increase the pension benefit retroactively that happened back in the 1990s. Then, subsequent to that, CalPERS assumptions weren't met, resulting in a large shortfall in accumulated pension plan assets today. In other words, they thought we'd be making more money, they would make more money, they didn't make that money, and that created a shortfall, which has grown and grown and grown. So CalPERS has an obligation, we have an obligation as citizens in Marin, to CalPERS of $179 million, to MCERA in San Rafael of $120 million, and then on the other post-employment benefit side, to CalPERS of $67 million and to MCERA for $33 million. That adds up to 401. So one of the stories that you hear, the dialogues you hear is, well, look, this shortfall, it's not that big of a deal. It's just because we've had a downturn in our marketplace. That might have stuck a few years ago, but look what's happened for the last 4 years. We've had extraordinary growth in our stock markets. So the S&P over the last 10 years has had an annualized return of almost 15%. The Dow, 15%. Russell 2000, 14%. So the idea that the shortfall in pension is a result of market declines in 2002 and 2018, that is not what the problem is. The problem is the benefits and funding levels don't match up, right? If you make a promise, you should pay for the promise. If you're not paying enough for the promise, then you're going to have a shortfall. And that's what's happened historically. Okay, so CalPERS over time has realized that they have a problem. They're responsible. They've looked into this and they've made some significant changes. The first thing they've done is they've increased their mortality assumptions. And as you know, you stop working, they pay you until you are no more. Okay? We are healthier now. We live longer now. And as a result of that, if CalPERS had found that people are living longer than expectations, and therefore they hadn't put enough money away for them. So CalPERS has made a decision to recognize the need to increase their mortality assumptions. The next thing they did is they said, okay, how much money are we going to make on this giant portfolio that we have in the market? You know, and it's mixed between bonds and stocks and the like. They've concluded that their prior assumptions were too optimistic. That's certainly been proven, and I don't think anyone in this room would argue with me about that. So they decided that they're going to lower their discount rate over a period of time to 7%. They've also moved to a more conservative investment mix. You know, when you're 25, when your kid's 25 and they start investing in a 401k plan, and you say, hey, go all stock, because by the time you're 60, it'll be better for you. And then as you move through life, you start saying, maybe I should shift more to bonds. And then when you're my age, you might say, okay, I'm going to not risk that much in the stock market. Well, the CalPERS population has changed over time. As more and more retirees are in the system, CalPERS has said, okay, we're no longer kids, we're more like middle-aged, and they've shifted their portfolio to a more conservative investment approach. And then finally, there's a thing called the actuarially determined contribution, ADC, and the way pensions work over time is you can do this many different ways. If you're a corporation, and that's where my great experience is on the corporate side, you could say, look, if the market's doing really good for 1 year, let's not make a contribution. If the market's doing really bad for 1 year, let's make up that shortfall. That variability is too dramatic because this is a very long-term promise. So the approach that the actuaries take is they smooth things, right? They say that we know we're not going to hit every year. It's important to hit the long run. Just like in a sailboat, you don't make minor adjustments. You just aim for the shore. So because of that, any sort of bad news or good news gets moved into your charge, the cost you have to pay each year slowly, okay? Well, because the shortfall has become so large, CalPERS has said we need to amortize the shortfall faster. And with that decision, which I think is prudent, you're going to have bigger bills coming to each of our cities, okay? So we're now paying the piper, right? So the big question is, how much is this going to cost? Well, I want to take one more point here. Are these actions enough? What CalPERS has done enough? We can spend hours debating whether the discount rate should be 7% or 6% or 6.5% or 4%. You can have this big, long conversation about whether the bills coming from CalPERS are adequate, but pretty much everybody agrees CalPERS is not being too optimistic. If anything, you know, they're not going to meet their new criteria. So I know, as a city council member, we could spend all our time talking about this debate at the state level about how CalPERS is acting. I'm not going there. We're not going there in this report because, quite simply, for the next 10 years, it does not matter to us because we have a shortfall. We have a bill that's coming and has to be paid. I told you how bad news amortizes over time. Good news also amortizes over time, right? So if we have an extraordinary period of good news, we're still going to have to work through this bad news period. We have bills to pay. And that's why, although it's quite interesting, and we could spend lots of time talking about it, I'm just taking the bills as they are. That's our topic for tonight. We can fill the room again and have a whole much longer conversation about whether it's going to be even worse, and I personally think it will be worse, but at least in the short run, I got bills to pay. So let's at least focus on that, okay? So that's the approach that Larry and I kind of settled on. Okay, so the League of California Cities has concluded that some cities may not be able to support future costs without drastic actions. So I said $401 million. What does that mean, you know? How does that relate to us as a town? The number's too big. Is it 401 million, 401 billion? Whatever, what's that number mean? How do we make it contextualize it? So here's a way to contextualize it. Okay, in 2006 and 2007, the average California city spent of its general fund budget about 8.3% on its bill to PERS. Okay? Now, over the recent past, that's gone up. It's 11.2%. okay? But because of the recent changes I just talked about, the increased mortality, the shortening of the amortization period, the lowering of the discount rate, all those kind of things, what's going to happen? We're expecting that between 2024 and 25, it's going to be 15.8%, okay? So what does that mean? CalPERS pension costs are almost going to double in the short term to us. Okay, the cities are going to have to pay much more money to CalPERS, and we'll spend some time talking about what that means in a minute. And as I pointed out before, this problem is not going away because of the way you amortize both gains and losses in slowly in the actuarial models. Okay, so I know we're starting thinking he's talking more like a funeral than a wedding. So let's talk about what we can do about this. Okay, what can be done? Well, there are some choices. These are the academic choices, not the practical ones. I'll tell you why they're not necessarily practical in a minute. Okay, you could raise taxes and fees. That's a possibility. You could lower benefits. That's a possibility. You could decrease the number of employees. That's a possibility. You can use existing reserves or borrow to ride this thing out. That's a possibility. Or you can reduce the services provided to your residents. Okay, those are all the academic ideas. Now let's get real about it, okay? Taxes and fees. We'll spend a minute later contrasting the benefits that people in the private sector and the public sector have. We're all aware of the issue of voter fatigue. We're competing with school boards, all these other organizations. There's a very excellent Joint Powers Authority in the fire area that I'm actually very thrilled about. That's going to be coming to us. There's voter fatigue headed our way, right? And that's an issue. Okay, can we lower benefits? Well, I want to differentiate between pensions and OPEBs, as Dick pointed out earlier, and that's important, okay? And we'll get into this California rule a bit later. But as far as the California rule is concerned, as we know, at this point, we cannot lower the promise that we make to our employees with regards to our pension. I'll get into it more in a minute. Okay, now, number of employees. Okay, we're not the federal government, right? In Mill Valley, I think there's 156, if I remember, 152 full-time employees. There was no one sitting around leaning on a shovel in my town. They all work really hard. They're hardworking, they're committed people. Because of the size of our problem, and I've worked in the corporate world, I ran budgets for 10, 15 years of my career. You can always find 1 or 2%, you know, in an economy, but there's no way that you can deal with this problem thinking employees will solve the problem, particularly in our smaller towns, which are already, by their very nature, quite lean, okay? So do you want to use your existing reserves? They're there for a reason. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Or you want to borrow more? You want to lean into the punch and keep continuing borrowing? I mean, you know, there's a time that these bills have to be paid, so I don't think that's practical. And then finally, okay, are we going to reduce the services provided to our residents? Well, that'll be a very pleasant conversation. I'm going to close the library on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I mean, what services are, you know, casually provided which could be easily eliminated? There aren't any, particularly in our smaller towns. So this is a very difficult problem. Okay, so what do we do about it? Okay, what can we do about it? I don't have any any sunshine excellent answers here, but there are some things we can do. There's three ideas that we came up with, and I'll cover each of them in a little more detail. The first one is develop a long-range plan. Know how bad the problem is going to be so you can have a sense of what to do. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. The next thing is to make our other post-employment benefit obligation more sustainable. Remember, OPEBs are healthcare costs, okay? And the third thing, which I'm really keen on, as a professional in the public accounting business, my job was to make sure that financial statements presented to investors were fairly presented. And we spent a lot of time focused on transparency. Okay, there's some transparency improvements I'm suggesting for all Marin cities, which I will share. So let's discuss each of these three ideas. Okay, and again, holler out if you got a question. Okay, so long-range plan. Let's figure out how big the hole is, right? Because these pension costs are going to get higher and higher and higher and higher. If we don't pay attention, your controller is going to open the bill one day and go, uh-oh, I don't have enough money. I can't pay my bill. So the point that we're trying to make to all our cities, because some are more prepared than others, every city needs to prepare a long-range plan, a 10-year plan, okay? So how do you do that? Okay, in our council meeting, there was a conversation where we've already presented the one in Mill Valley a month or so ago, and one of the council members said, why did you include a recession? That shouldn't be in the base plan. The base plan shouldn't have a recession. And I said, no, excuse me. There have been 12 recessions since 1945. There's a recession every 6 years. Assume a recession over this next 10 years. It will happen. You have to, at least on your baseline, assume there's going to be a recession. Then, since we've just done this in Mill Valley, I can give you some thoughts about how this works. Each city's revenues are different, its property taxes are different, and the like. So let's talk about recession sensitivity. Some cities generate more of their income from sales tax. Other cities generate more of their income from property tax. We get into this in some detail in the report. It's like 90 pages. How does your property tax work? Well, normally, property tax, as a result of Prop 13, is limited to a 2% increase each year, right? If things are going well. But what actually happens is we have value, the value of our houses that we purchased many years ago is worth certainly a lot more than the assessed value. So when a house is sold, you remark, right? And that results in a higher property tax from the new person than the old person. Similar things happen when there are remodels. Right? That incremental value increase attracts an additional tax. So while taxes are going up around, property taxes are limited to 2%, what's happened in Marin, particularly in Marin, because our values have gone up, is that we typically see 5 to 5.5%. Okay, that's I believe the assumption for the county is 5.5% at this point. So what happens in a recession? In a recession, fewer houses will be sold, okay? And so that 5 is going to drift down, but it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. You got your floor. Now, you can be reassessed to a lower level, but talking to our controller and looking through the past recessions, you might move from a 5% growth rate to a 3% to a 2%, but it's a relatively stable source of revenues for cities. So if your city relies highly on property taxes, that makes you a little more stable than cities that rely a lot on sales taxes. Sales taxes, of course, are much more volatile when it comes to a recession, when you build in your recession. Mill Valley doesn't have a lot of commercial revenues from sales taxes, but even us, people buy hamburger instead of steaks, you know? They get less gas because they're not driving to work. So the sales tax component is a much bigger component. So I can't come out and tell you what each city should do. Every city needs to look at this separately, but they need to take realistic assumptions about what's going to happen with at least one recession over the next 10 years. And then at the same time, you can get a very detailed analysis of what your pension costs are going to be. There are actuaries out there, and because of the slow nature of the revision over time, you can get a pretty solid understanding of what your bills are going to be on the pension side. So salary assumption, pension assumption, et cetera, you plug all those in together, and you can get a measure for the size of the whole. And Mill Valley's already done it, and the hole does get pretty big for a while, and then it starts to settle later as the bad news works its way into our cost structure. But that's something very important to do. Know how bad the problem is so you can then react to it. Okay, so what do you do after you've run your numbers and you see what your hole is? Because that's exactly where we are. We've done our baseline. We've seen what the hole is, and now a subcommittee is going to take the next step to say, what are we going to do about it? What hard decisions are we going to make as a city? And the point is you should get out in front of it to make those hard decisions. So what are some of the choices you can make? Well, you can make smaller cuts now to avoid big cuts later. You can put some funds away now into your pension costs so that the later cost increases will be less dramatic. So we've looked at this. In other words, if I know I'm going to have to pay 140 in 3 years, maybe in 100 today, maybe I put away an extra 20 if I can afford it, so that when I have my higher bills later, I built up a little bit of a nest egg. You see what I mean? So that's something that can be done. We've identified 3 technical ways to do that. You can simply pay CalPERS more now. You can create what's called a 115 trust, or you can designate some funds within your balance sheet for future use. There's some technical components to that. I'm glad to talk later about some of the details. There's different levels of flexibility and potential investment return with each of those 3 approaches, and each city can make their own choice about it. I'm not going to evangelize that one of them is better than the other 2. It really kind of depends on how you feel about things. But that's another possibility. Okay, so we can pursue greater taxes and fees. As I said, you know, we have to deal with the reality of voter fatigue. And another important thing that is not generally discussed, remember, the federal tax just changed state and local tax deductions, so-called SALT, right? We are now, in California, not been able to deduct all those state taxes that we pay. We have a 13.5% highest state tax rate in America, in the country. Well, guess what? We don't get the federal deduction for that anymore. So all of a sudden, we're going to feel that at home when we pay our taxes. And that's going to impact our willingness as members of the community to sign up for more taxes, okay? So that's something else to think about. So the point of a long-range plan is see how bad it is, and then start thinking creatively about what to do. And this conversation that you have to have needs to have your employees involved, your taxpayers involved, and all other decision makers involved. I was able to give this presentation in the town of Mill Valley 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I was very pleased that we had a lot of city employees who were in the unions at the meeting. And I was very happy that they were there because they need to hear what's happening, you know, because we're kind of all in this together. And if a city fails, you're not going to meet your employees' promise. So we have a very important ethical obligation to be able to meet our employees' costs. Okay, so that's the pension side. Now let's focus on OPEBs, other post-employment benefits, okay? OPEBs are different than pensions. They're not part of the California rule. You have more flexibility in negotiating your other post-employment benefits with your employees than you do with your pensions. And it's actually quite interesting. Cities have got very different levels of promise to their employees. I didn't realize that my town was super nice historically. I do understand it now. So because it varies by cities, level of benefits varies by city. One thing I'd like to encourage all our city managers to do, this is kind of a complicated number. So when you're in closed session negotiating what you think is fair for police and fire or miscellaneous or whatever, you know, all the cities do the same thing. They collect what everybody else pays. And certainly all our groups do the very same thing. But what they don't do is they don't compare the actual cost associated with the other post-employment benefits, and it's complicated, all right? So I'm proposing that in the future, when this work is done, that at least one actuary comes in and kind of gives a like price sense to what the promise is for various cities. For instance, Novato has a very, very small OPEB obligation. Okay, so to me, that would say if I'm a Novato employee, I should get more current pay. Okay, now Mill Valley has a very generous post-employment obligation. If I'm a Mill Valley employee, as I'm saying, we're giving it to you when you retire, not now. If you don't like that, maybe you should talk to us about lowering your retirement, right? So people don't understand how expensive these costs are. And if you pull our report out on page 56, we show the net obligation by city, and it really varies dramatically from 1 million, 9 million, 1 million, 17 million, 23 million, et cetera. You get the sense. It bounces all over the place. So you have more flexibility with regards to OPEBs. There's also a thing that if you are a city that provides your current health care and you take that from the medical benefit plan that CalPERS offers, the Public Employees Medical and Hospital Care Act, PEMHCA, that requires a certain small minimum benefit be given to retirees. Some cities have been very smart about this. They're only paying that small benefit to their retirees. I believe Novato is one of those, and that's why their post-employment benefit cost is so low. When looking at OPEBs, because you can negotiate, you should pay attention to this. Then one more thing as far as OPEBs are concerned. And to me, this is super, it's just a matter of ethic. Many cities have been kicking the can down the road with regards to their OPEB obligation. They've been using what's called a pay-go approach. So the bill comes from Kaiser or from whoever, they pay their bill and they go on to the next year. That made sense 30 years ago when healthcare costs were low. I watched this literally happen in the corporate side. Back in 1988, I was in our national office when this happened. There was a rule change made that said you need to accrue the full cost of your promise just like a pension for your healthcare. Right? Because when someone retires, you should have, by the date they've retired, put enough money away to cover that promise through their whole retirement. You're not getting any benefit from them in retirement. They're not working for you anymore. So put that money away. Many, many cities are not doing this now. okay? So one of our recommendations is to fund the fully actuarial determined contribution for all employees. And by the way, as a taxpayer, that extra money earns money. It's cheaper in the long run, right? Because it's earning interest, okay? And it's also ethical because if a city fails, the next day you're a retiree, you may not have any health care coverage, and that's actually happened. So I think it's an obligation. If you promise to give this to your employees, then you should pay them for it. The other thing you can do is you can negotiate it away. In Mill Valley, we've actually, with our cooperation of our representative groups, that we are not providing OPEBs to our new employees. Instead, we're paying something, they're paying into a separate account. It's called a retirement health savings account. So we put away 1%, they put away 1%, and they'll have money for retirement. That's a defined contribution plan as compared to a defined benefit plan. With a defined contribution plan, you know your bill, you pay it, you're done. The issue with a defined benefit plan is you don't know what it's going to be because you've got all the risk of investments. Okay, next component is transparency. So, city financial statements are aggregated by function. There's a group called the GASB, Government Accounting Standards Boards, which tells all our cities how to put their books together, okay? So, they do it by function, by fire, police, library, rather than by cost, like payroll, benefit, purchases, and the like, okay? I'm a CPA, I've read financial statements for 30 years. I mean, I've looked at, I couldn't think of how many financial statements I've looked at in my life, some of them extremely complicated. I couldn't figure out what our benefits costs were in Mill Valley because they're not out there, okay? You can get into the budget cycle, and you got to dig deep in the budget cycle to find that information. So I talked to our Eric, our controller, or CFO, whatever he's called, and said, come on, you have to meet the GASB requirements, but you can tell the public more. There's nothing wrong with telling more. So for the last 2 years, I thought it was really interesting. We did this, and we didn't hear anything from anybody about this. But for the last 2 years, Mill Valley has published a table, okay? And it's an additional table to the financial statements. And what it says is we spent $14,104,984 on salaries and wages in the fiscal year ending June 17. We spent $8,212 on benefits. 58%, for every dollar we spend on salaries, we spend 58 cents on benefits. It's pretty big numbers, okay? And it's all broken out here, so we can tell you what it is. How much of it is our OPEB expense? A couple of $1 million. How much goes to coppers? a couple of $1 million. We have a pension obligation bond. We have our medical and dental premiums. We have, workers' comp, disability, all that stuff. That information should be available to all of us to understand what these benefits are, right? Both to our citizens and to our employees. Okay, so those were my 3 suggestions, right? Do a budget, be more forthright with regards to what your numbers are, and then take a hard focus on your other post-employment benefits because you have some flexibility there, okay? So that's what we came up with in terms of what the costs are. I'm going to close with one more topic, and I think this topic is important. I think people in the public don't understand, and people, council members maybe, and certainly our employees don't understand how the promise is different between what you get if you're an employee of a public enterprise or you're a corporate person someone working for a corporation here in Marin, okay? I think that's important to understand for a variety of reasons. One is voter fatigue, okay? If you, as a voter, have to make a decision about additional taxes related to a benefit that you nowhere near have, you're going to be less interested in that benefit, right, than other ways to spend our tax money. So I want to give you some statistics. The purpose of this conversation is not to say that pensions are bad, right, or OPEBs are bad, because that's not what I'm doing here. I worked in corporate America for 30 plus years. I saw all sorts of different compensation plans, right, from extreme to minute. You know, I'm an accountant. I'm just giving you the numbers, okay, so you get a sense of that. These were all footnoted, so you pull the report out. I'm not making these numbers up. So remember a defined benefit pension plan. A defined benefit pension plan says when you retire, you can count on this money. It's yours. You'll get it no matter what. All the risk associated with putting enough investments away, that stays with the corporation, okay? So those are defined benefit plans. How many people in America have defined benefit plans where they're sufficient to cover their retirement so they don't also need a 401k type plan? 4%. of America, all of us, have a defined benefit plan where pensions, a DB plan where the pensions are sufficient. Another 13% have access to both a defined benefit pension plan and a 401k type plan. So let me tell you what those are about, because I watched them happen. Back in the 80s and 90s, when pension costs became extraordinary, most of corporate America said, we can't continue this. We have to have an alternative. I was in the boardrooms, I watched the pain occur when corporate America made a decision to say, okay, what you've earned to date, that's what vested means, by the way. What you've earned to date based on your employment, that's what vested means, except in the California rule. What you've earned to date vested, that's what you've got. We're going to convert you prospectively and give you a 401k plan, and we'll put in some matching, okay? When corporate America made that decision, employees are free to go elsewhere, right? So if they were not fair to their employees, they would lose their employees. And these were the conversations I heard in the boardroom. And people were very unhappy about this, but they found a way to make it work. That's what happened in corporate America. And that's why you'll see 13% of us as a country has a combination of both a defined benefit and a defined contribution. You add all that up, 17% in total have any kind of pension promise. Yeah. And most of that is frozen. Okay, so I'm going to throw you some numbers because I live for numbers. So let me do some numbers here, okay? Oops, there. All right. The average monthly Social Security payment in January 2019 was $1,461 a month across America. The maximum possible benefit payment, based on an annual salary of $132,900, is $2,861 per month. Now, I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you, and then I'm going to put them all together in one slide at the end because, you know, everybody will get lost in these numbers. The way Social Security works is you get paid, you contribute, right? You have to pay a 6.2% tax of your salary in to create your Social Security benefit. Once you reach a salary of $132,000, no more tax, no more benefit. So you're stopped in terms of the amount of money that you will receive at $2,861 per month. That's the maximum amount of Social Security you can obtain. So if you take a look at citizens, how are we with retirement savings? In 2015, the GAO published a study on retirement savings. Among those with some retirement savings, the median amount of those savings was about $104,000 for households aged 55 to 64, and $148,000 for households aged 65 to 74. This is equivalent to a monthly annuity of about $310 a month, $300 to $600 a month, okay? So if you're a typical American, you're going to have $300 to $600 a month in your 401k plan, and you're going to be getting somewhere between $1,400 and $2,800 a month from your Social Security, okay? So compare that to what happens if you are lucky enough to work in Marin County in the public sector. So I got some numbers, and I'll tell you what's wrong with them, because there's some ways they're too conservative and there's some ways they're too liberal, and I want to be full in terms of my disclosure. So a miscellaneous employee in Marin retiring after 40 years and a 2.5% benefit factor and $87,638 average as their final compensation would get $7,303 a month. Okay, so the typical Marin public employee, their average salary is $87,638. That's why I chose that number. It's the average salary. I did find a median number, which is about the same. You know, the difference between average and median. A few rich people, you know, make a change. There's not much influence there. Okay, so that understates things because the average employee is not the retiring employee. If you have 100 employees and you're going to retire 5 of them this year, those 5, just because they're the oldest employees, will be making more than the average employee will. Okay, so that's why this is a conservative, you know, you could make that number look a lot worse. Now you'd say 40 years. Who works 40 years? Well, if you start at 25 and you retire at 65, that's 40 years. And remember, your CalPERS salary is movable. As long as you stay in the system, you can move around. And then if you don't, say you only work 30 years, because that lowers the amount of money you get from this promise, well, then you would have spent 10 years somewhere else earlier in life, and maybe you put money away in a 401k plan. So it's not an unreasonable measure. Now let's take another example. Let's take a miscellaneous employee who made $132,900. Now remember, that's the magic number for Social Security. Anything above that doesn't earn any benefit, okay? So I crank these numbers out, and you can see that you get $11,000 a month as compared to $2,800 a month, about 4 times more money. Now, are there people who make $132,000? There are 37 employees in Mill Valley out of our 150 employees roughly that make that level of salary, okay? So the point is there are quite significant differences between these costs, and I think it's important for people to understand that. So that's why we want to put those numbers out there. So those conclude my remarks. Hope they were helpful. And I guess now we're going to introduce Larry, and then we'll get into a dialogue.
John, thank you. You're going to get 3 credits at Marin Community College for that lecture. But if you do, you'll be tested on it. I would hope that every member of all 55 members of Marin City Councils would have heard that and hear what Larry has to say. And I would certainly hope our Board of Supervisors and our special district directors would say that. One thing before I introduce Larry, I just want you to note that the number 401 million, is that the number? Yeah. 401 million, this is the mayor's and councilman's report. That implies, correct me if I'm wrong, the 11 incorporated cities and the county. So, yes, yes. It only includes the 11 incorporated cities. The debt of the amount owed, including the county, the special districts, the fire districts and all those folks, and the school districts, that doesn't include it. That's more. So understand the numbers, and the report deals with the mayor's and councilman's assignment, the 11 municipalities in Marin County. So the county numbers, am I right, are significantly larger than that. This is for the cities, so be aware of that. Larry Chu was elected in 2003, and finishing his 4th and final term, which will end on December 11th this year. 3 times mayor, 4 times vice mayor, past presidents of Marin Mayor of Councils, Marin Council of Mayors and Council Members. He organized and chaired the MCCMC Committee on Pensions and OPEB Reform in 2011 and wrote that report. That was the pioneering first report on this done by the mayors and councilmen. In 2019, he co-authored the report with John McCauley. Professionally, he's been in the financial service industry since 1979 in a wide swath of operational roles, including accounting, finance, tax. He's currently registered with the Internal Revenue Service. Information security, he's currently certified. Business continuity, currently certified. Venture capital due diligence, pension administration, and reporting. He has a bachelor's degree from UC and an MBA from San Francisco State University. It's a pleasure to have really the pioneer of pension reform analysis in Marin County, Larry Chu.
So, are you going to make a separate presentation, or we're just going to take questions?
Yeah, just take questions right now. All right, I wanted to give Larry all due. Let's do questions then, okay?
Okay.
Right.
Sounds
All
good.
right, and it's going to be first come, first served. This is not a campaign night, so you're not restricted to your answers in 2 minutes. These are complicated questions, and you might have a more sophisticated question to ask, so there's no limit on that either. But if you have a desire to ask one particular member of the panel the questions, please say who. If it's a general question, you don't care who answers it, or if they both answer it, say otherwise. This gentleman up here was first. And if you do it as loud as we can, so we can hear you. They were going to bring a microphone just so everybody, not everybody can hear it, just the...
I think you really, unless there's more concrete solutions than I've heard here and I've seen, you really have three choices how this thing ends. One, it ends up in bankruptcy, many of these districts, not all of them. Many of these districts, not all of them, you have a bankruptcy situation. The second is this California Act that you say is sacrosanct is not sacrosanct. It says should, and now there's the municipality should provide something of equal value. It doesn't say must. That's the whole argument, is does it say must? Now, I don't understand how anybody could go before a court of law and argue that should is really must. It's either must or should, and it says should, and it should. The third argument is that what you can do is you can get an independent board, I mean really independent, not made up of city council members that are more or less short-term except for Larry, and the members of that are in the working for the city who actually have a vested interest in having this thing come out all right, because they're going to step into those shoes. And I don't see them digging their own grave. So those are your three outcomes. And those are concrete. And I'd like to hear something concrete about the solutions rather than to restate the problem. Everybody knows the problem. There's not enough money and there's too many benefits.
Thank you. The basic question is, so what else can you do, right? Yes, let's do this one. How's that?
Okay, you probably heard from John's presentation. Yeah, there are a lot of things that are pretty limited that you can do. I'll probably get some disagreement from at least two people in this room that I've talked to. But, one of my outgoing actions before I get done in December is effectively to refinance Larkspur's debt. We're in a good position right now where interest rates are low, and we have taken out a pension obligation bond. And what we're doing is that we can pay off our current pension obligations for the next 20 years by financing it at 2.7% on average rather than to pay CalPERS the 7%. Now, with the savings in that interest rate, we are not going to use it for other municipal services. We're going to continue to use that savings to pay down some of the other obligations that we have associated with pensions and other post-employment benefits. Now, one of the things that's attractive now is that if you look back historically, you might not have gotten a fixed interest rate. You might not have been able to pay the bond off before it matured, what they call callable. But both those provisions exist, and I think one of the key arguments of not doing a pension obligation bond is basically based on the premise that you're going to use default as a tool. We view it as an obligation whether we have to pay it off every month or not. So when you have an actual debt, you have to pay that off. Well, that's to pay off the same obligation you have to the employees. Some people have said, well, you can take that pension obligation, but maybe you won't pay it in the future. But now you're locked into paying this pension obligation bond. And, I think both ethically, legally, and otherwise, we recognize that regardless of whether that obligation is soft or very specific, we're going to end up paying it. And at this point, it does clear us for the next 20 years.
I just want to add a few more comments to that, if it's okay. So, where are you, whoever you were? So, so I've been on council for 6 years, and before that, 6 years as a planning commissioner. We went through and we negotiated and removed our OPEB obligation for our new employees. That was not an easy task. That's something that can be done, and it can be done, and we're encouraging other cities to look at their OPEB obligation, because that is an area that people have not paid attention to. Let me finish. On the pension side, okay. On the pension side, I want people to understand that, it's a huge issue. It's above our pay grade. I can't change the pension rules, right? I can lobby my senator, which we are actually meeting in a few weeks to do, but we can all spend more time talking to our Congress and our Senate about it. I will tell you that there is zero appetite right now in California to do anything about this. They thought PEPRA solved the problem when PEPRA was just a very, very small thing. What will happen eventually is some cities are going to fail. That's what I think fundamentally will happen. And when some cities fail, as long as our cities aren't the ones that have failed because we've looked out and saw how big our hole was and made the appropriate changes, the changes we can make to put ourselves in survival mode, then we'll see change. So that's my view on that. I'm not as crazy as Larry is about pension obligation bonds. In our paper, we talk about it. I'm not going to take a loan out of my house and put it in the stock market, and that's kind of what this is. We can differ on that, but it is also, rates are very low right now, so if you're ever going to do a POB, now would be the time. So just say every council has to make their own mind up about that question. So.
Yeah, so Larry knows I was one of the two people who's going to take issue with that, the pension obligation bonds, which is basically, to John's point, gambling in the market, assuming you're going to earn a spread. Yeah, Belvedere did a sale leaseback or a lease leaseback on their town yard, and literally the mayor said, oh, it's a little arbitrage, right? I don't think our municipal leaders should be engaging in arbitrage. Now, this doesn't actually defease the liability, right? You're not actually exiting from CalPERS because that discount rate is quite different, right? It's 3.5%. So that's the fallacy. Most people don't realize if you want to leave CalPERS, the liability is massive because they're not going to take any risk on your leaving. So I would question the premise, and Bill Sharp at Stanford is on record at the pension media workshop that they had 2 years ago, highlighting what a bad idea that is, because it's arbitrage.
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing, though, is that we're not investing the money, at least not directly. We're paying off CalPERS.
But they're assuming they're going to earn 7% forever.
Yeah.
So when the next recession hits and it's in the dirt, you're underwater. You're going to owe more for the hole that was created.
Yeah, but that's going to happen.
No.
You're going to end up owing more irrespective of whether you've paid off your current obligations or not.
The next crisis will lead to the fix because it will become patently obvious to everybody that it's irredeemable. So
yeah, and, yeah, and I think if everybody looks at their city's respective financial reports, the one thing that they all have to put in is what CalPERS projected returns are for the next 10 years and then 10 years plus. And you'll find that a weighted average based on their asset mix is about 4.8%. So if anybody thinks that 7% is the appropriate discount rate, it's not going to stop there.
From my experience in the past, these benefit packages, which are so generous, were based on the fact that these people had low pay going through their career, that people in the public sector were generally underpaid people, and they were compensated by having these generous benefits plus jobs for life, kind of what in China they call the Iron Rice Bowl. In California, we have the Iron Rice Bowl and a very generous compensation package. So I think that we're seeing now that the public sector people are making substantially more for their skill level, their responsibility, their employment risk, etc., than anyone in the private sector. The private sector is really highly competitive and grinding down people. And there's no question about that. Just take a look at what people are going through in the private sector to stay above water versus people who are working for the government. So my suggestion is that the solution here is a moratorium on any future pay raises, that we cap these salaries and benefits right now, even if we have to have a initiative on the ballot, so that this privileged class of employees, of workers in the state, is brought back into line with the rest of us. And I think that would go a long way to providing a sense of justice here, because these pay and compensation packages just reek of injustice. Anyways, that's my
For what
thought.
it's worth, I like numbers, you know, I ran numbers. I believe your truth is in your numbers. So let me give you some information that is consistent with what you've just said. There's a website, Statistics California, which gives you the household income percentiles in Marin County. So I just pulled Marin today. So at the 95th percentile, you would be at $250,000 a year. At the 95th percentile, that's what a good city manager makes. At the 60th percentile, you'd be at 125. At the median percentile, you'd be at 100. These are for this is for the private sector, okay? And at the very low end, at the lowest 20, make $37,000 a year. If you compare that to the median salary of our employees, which is around 100,000, it feels relatively consistent. I would say that it feels like public employees and private employees on their salary are in relatively the same ballparks. So this is household income. That's what this report says. And we could all go down a rabbit hole about all these questions. As I said earlier in my presentation, I wasn't going to have a long, drawn-out conversation as to whether CalPERS should be at 7 or at 4 or at 3, because I just know there's a bill coming. And similarly, with the question as to whether we're treating our public and our private employees, whether the pay scales are equivalent, it is what it is, you know? I mean, I think that what you need to do is go take a look at how big the problem is and look at what levers you have as a city to deal with it. Share those levers with your employees, because your employees have an equal interest in making sure you're around to pay things off. So maybe it's salaries, right? Maybe it's getting rid of the post-employment benefits. Maybe it's changing the service levels that we provide to our employees. Maybe it's, as Larry suggests, do a pension obligation bond, which I don't like. You have to at least understand where you are to survive until the inevitable problem occurs, which will create the long-term solution.
This is a little bit of a follow-up on that comment, and it does have to do with the numbers do tell the truth. So what you've concluded from your numbers is that salaries in the private sector and salaries in the public sector are comparable, and then you showed us an exhibit to show that pensions and post-employment benefits are massively out of line. So if you add the two together, the conclusion is that the public employees are earning more than their private sector counterparts. They certainly have far lower turnover, and I would argue a far less competitive and stressful environment. So I'm not so sure I would say a moratorium, but I think on your chart of options up there, one of the things you didn't list and should be is salary restraint until there is better parity between a fully loaded analysis, including pensions and OPEB and salary, between the public and the private sector. And I think you said, I may have heard you wrong, but when everyone walks into negotiations, they all walk in with these comparisons, but the comparisons are all to other private sectors. I spent a great deal of, public sector organizations, I spent a great deal of time trying to convince the Board of Supervisors to include private sector analysis in that, and they had no interest in doing that for what I think is an obvious reason, because it just creates a virtuous cycle of compensation for public employees, and we need to put a stop to that.
I think there's a couple things, and maybe it'll help validate at least the direction you're going. You know, there was a time when public employees were getting less money than their private counterparts. And yes, the pension gave them something, or their benefits later in life. And certainly one of the things it did not allow people with lower salaries to do was to accumulate wealth. You know, so now we do know that over the course of the last 15 to 20 years that there has been more salary parity, at least on the positions that you can compare, you know, finance people. Hard to compare, say, police officer. Right. But the one point that you're bringing up, and I agree with at least personally, is, you know, I've talked to other people in elected capacities when they deal with their own negotiations or their payroll related discussions, and you really can't look at salary anymore. You have to look at the total compensation. So as one goes up, then you know that you have basically a cap in terms of what you can afford. So we know that people want to take more home in their paycheck, but the fact of the matter is, as an employer, you need to recognize that there are increases in benefits, whether they're health care or other, you know, any kind of post-employment benefit.
I guess, did the 15.8% general fund contribution that you mentioned include the OPEB? Did not.
No, that was just coppers. That was just coppers.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's statewide numbers. There's an actuarial group called Bartell that a number of us have used. You guys have used them too. That gives city-specific information, and it's very consistent with the statewide studies.
So with that, what would it be? Do you know? What would that add to the 15.8% currently?
So the cities vary dramatically in what their promises are. And what I was suggesting earlier is that we should globally, both for the union negotiators and for the public side, to understand what those cost variances are so that they were properly taken into account by city.
When you ran it to 2024, I think, did you have an inkling of what it would be in 2034?
It eventually, the whole idea of what PERS is doing is that they're trying to fill the bucket. And the idea is they fill it over time so they don't crush the cities. And the presumption is that they were going to continue to maintain the 7% assumed rate of return. As was PEPRA. PEPRA was assumed to say we're not going to have a shortfall with PEPRA. And just so you know, even though we've had a good market the last couple of years, there's already been a shortfall with PEPRA. So, as I said earlier, I don't hear people standing up and down and saying that Coppers is being way too pessimistic, right? They're being optimistic. So those numbers, if everything comes out as expected, you have to pay in for a period of around 10 years, then it kind of slopes back down. That's what the numbers show. But of course, if there's continued slippage, there'll be continued costs. And as I said earlier, the whole idea of these long-range approaches is that both good news and bad news amortizes in slower. So if it gets worse, it'll just be out there for more years.
The sensitivity you did or that's been done on the discount rate, is that also being done to some degree on increased life expectancy, which always seems to be underestimated by every actuarial system, such as Social Security? That's all I had. Thank you.
There is a 1%. Yeah, there is, in the tables, there is a mortality sensitivity, a number in addition to the discount rate effect.
To go down your rabbit hole, how would it work if you went to a defined contribution plan with the counties and the employees bore most of the risk, for example, in a downturn and such? And then the other question is, how is I was reading that the pension obligations for the state employees is much lower than it is for the counties and cities. If you can comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with where the state sits. I'm too busy trying to figure out where my town is. You know, ultimately, I'd love it if there was a change at the state level that would allow cities to move in the same direction as corporate America did, which would be fair to our employees, which would say everything you've earned to date you've got in a defined benefit plan, and then prospectively work out a deal for a defined contribution plan that reflects what everybody else in America does. You put money away in a 401k and get a match for it, shifting some of the risk away from some of the investment risk away from the employer to the employee, which is, we write about that in the report.
In large part, one of the things that Brown proposed during Pepper was to go to a hybrid, and that was in recognition that a lot of public agencies don't have Social Security. Social Security was always not meant to fund your retirement. It was meant to be a safety net. So there can still be a safety net component built into it, but in large part, the post-employment benefits need to be shifted so that the risk is shared with the employees.
Larry makes a good point there, because you look at these costs and you say, oh, this is egregious. You got to take a step back, and that's why I put all those numbers out there. It says, no, wait a minute, some of that is the same thing everybody else gets, because public employees in Marin have not generally opted into I think somebody did, I think the water district did, but I'm not sure about that. Most of the cities have not opted into the relative safety of Social Security, which charges 6.2% both sides. So employer and employee both put that money away, and it goes into Social Security. So some of the benefit that is being provided in the city pension is the equivalent of that, but it's richer than that. You can see it's 3 to 4 times that. So you got to at least be fair and recognize that part of it is the equivalent of a Social Security benefit.
Can I just grab the microphone for a second? I'm going to ask my first question, if that's okay. 2 things I just appreciate you'd mentioned, one of which is you haven't mentioned the difference between miscellaneous employees and public safety folks. I have a friend of mine, former councilman, who's been a labor person for a long time, and says, keep your eye on the public safety folks. That's where the real expense is. I'd just like you to comment on that. Second, I'm on Medicare. I work for myself all my life. It's a terrific plan. Why are we paying post-retirement benefits that exceed Medicare? Why can't we just put the folks on Medicare? I'll swear by Medicare. So I think it's been a great experience, but these folks are paying for a completely different plan that seems to be based upon a system that existed before Medicare was created. Just my own personal curiosity, and then we'll go to this gentleman.
I'm going to find the public safety then. I'm going to find the numbers.
I think you were asking about the difference between public safety and miscellaneous? Yeah. Oh, okay. The miscellaneous, well, public safety is easier. That's police and fire, at least with the municipal governments here in Marin. Public safety with the state can also include things that they've negotiated to add, like the County of Los Angeles includes their lifeguards. So the public safety benefits are a lot higher in terms of what their benefit factors are and how much they can max out. So in Marin, typically the benefit factor is about 3% per year, but some of our cities allow them to retire at 55 years old and others at 50. Even though it's 5 years, there's a huge difference in how much the employer ends up absorbing. I won't get into those types of numbers. Their maximum is 90%, so if they work 30 years and they get to their retirement age, then that's what they retire out at. With the miscellaneous, it could be anywhere from 2.5% a year, where they retire at 55. Usually Marin, that's typically the youngest. I think Belvedere has theirs at 2%. And I can't remember if they retired out at 55 or 57. But one of the things that Pepper allowed, for example, was to even raise that age to 62, because there's a recognition that people are living longer, which means they also need to be working longer.
Yeah, so what happens in most cities is that once you reach Medicare age, you get a Medicare Advantage type plan, right? So that is a much lower cost for what Medicare doesn't otherwise cover. So Medicare basically covers your most of. You have a Medicare Advantage plan?
No, I have a Medicare supplement.
Okay.
And it's I had the 2 operations that they paid 100% of it.
Yeah.
I belong to a communist single payout.
I actually just I just joined this plan myself. I don't know exactly how I feel about the fact that I'm now 65, but just to give you some numbers, again, I like the numbers. The Kaiser premium that for based on one city's cost quote, the Kaiser premium for an employee under age 65 was $8,652 a year. Okay, this Kaiser premium for that same employee in Medicare Advantage at age 65 and over is $3,904, right? From $8,600 to $3,904. So when you look at your OPEB obligation, and I've looked into this carefully, your OPEB costs are substantial until you reach 65, between 55 and 65. And it's really interesting. Pension and OPEBs are upside down. In the corporate world, when they first started looking at healthcare, I was, like I said, in our national office, and we called the pension the smart promise. We called OPEBs the dumb promise. And the reason we said that from the employer perspective is you want people to stay with you. They're experienced, right? Part of the reason for a pension is to encourage people to stick around, right? And the longer they pay, the longer they stick around, the more they get. What happens with the healthcare is it's upside down. The earlier you leave, the more benefit you get, right? It's expensive when you leave at 55, right? And then you go to 65. The healthcare cost is, you can balance the two. Is it better to go at 55 or to go at 65 if you're the employer? The healthcare cost is extreme during those early years, so that's expensive, but then it's less on the pension side. So there's kind of a break-even point that surrounds those two things. But the point is that all the cities recognize that once you're age 65, you should be in Medicare, and they are. And like many people in America, we put them into a Medicare Advantage supplemental plan.
I want to echo what this gentleman said over here, which is, oh, sorry.
Go.
Ultimately, this is a political problem. And so take us into the next recession that you're forecasting and how that manifests in terms of reform. Because I think unequivocally the next downturn will render this completely, patently unsustainable, given everything else you put up there. And the other interesting thing is, first of all, kudos to both of you and Dick for being here, the reports, everything. I know both of you well over the past few years. You know, we couldn't have better stewards locally. And Marin is a very wealthy county, so we are literally the canary in the gold mine. And if we're under this kind of pressure, you can only imagine what is going to manifest in other parts of California. And Dick, just to reiterate what you said, you see Novato school teachers, not striking, but upset. Mill Valley, exact same thing. I don't think they realize the CalSTRS contributions are going to 19.1% from 8%. That's where all the money's going. And so how do we shift the angst and the ire from against each other to where it deservedly resides, which is Sacramento?
You know, John made a comment near the beginning of his presentation about building sustainability for Marin. And, you know, we discussed that in our committee, and the best way we can characterize it humorously is it's like the two guys running away from the cheetah. Okay? The slower guy, you don't want to be the slow guy. And that's true of Marin, because what we believe is going to happen, especially since we've seen the failure of some JPAs as well as some other small cities. You know, I mean, in case of one city, their retirees only got back like 10% of what they put into it. You know, a couple of them were doing a little better. They got like 40%. One of them got half back. But the fact of the matter is that if some of these communities who are not in a good financial position end up needing to default in some way, or they go bankrupt, or any way that you can characterize their financial distress, we believe that Sacramento will have to do something. So we don't want to survive, and we don't want to be the ones who end up bankrupt or in financial distress. So we're going to try and outrun the slow people.
And if all the 11 Marin cities follow this guidance and come up with a long-term plan and understand within the next 12 months how bad it is, and then have the direct conversations that I suggested between all the various interested parties, we can begin that dialogue and start making some of the painful decisions early, which people aren't going to like, but at least you're the faster one with that cheetah chasing you.
But even within Marin, there's a huge amount of diversity. I mean, you look at Mill Valley, versus say San Rafael or Nevada Fire, where their pension cost is 40% of payroll or 50% of payroll. So we may have some, within the county, we may be in that race, and there may be winners and losers with the cheetah hot on their heels.
Well, absolutely. That's why I said when I had the conversation about doing the 10-year plan, every city is very different, right? And we were focused on cities, but fire districts are also different than cities because their revenue source is pure. It's just the tax bill that they put out to you, and the fire district is not competing with, you know, libraries and rec and, you know, fire and police and all that other stuff. So their dynamic is different. And the city's dynamics also vary dramatically based on how their revenues are derived and how stable they are. And that's the point. We all have to open our eyes up and take a look and see who's bad, who's really bad, and who's relatively okay. Because I think that when this is done, I don't know this for sure, but I can think of a couple of cities, I imagine, that are going to be in worse shape than others. So that's why we think it's so important to get this done. Our gentleman here said, hey, you're just restating the problem. I want to attack the problem. I'm not just, people don't even know what the problem is right now. So I want to attack the problem and let everybody understand its breadth and scope and length. And maybe that will have some impact on Sacramento. I doubt it, but that's my feeling.
Thanks, Dick, and thank you, Larry and John, for putting this together. A lot of the questions here we all deal with in San Rafael, being on the City Council in San Rafael. We are a little bit different than some of the others because we participate in MCCMC, different than some of the other cities that were with CalPERS. And yes, to the point that some of these cities have higher pension obligations as a percentage of their general fund is correct. But we often look at how we're going to resolve these. And one of the things that San Rafael has done is with our amortization of our unfunded liability is a lot less than CalPERS. So if you look at our financials in San Rafael, while we have a higher contribution currently to our MCCMC unfunded liability, that significantly drops off within the next 10 years because I believe it's somewhere around 70 to 80% of our unfunded liability will be retired within the next 10 years. I think it's 2030. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy because we do have a higher contribution now, but going forward, we'll hopefully be one of those cities that will be in a much better financial picture, 10 years from now. So there is some light out there. But one of the things that I've heard and seen here today, which you'd mentioned, there's things that the 4 things that you could do to help, and one of those was staffing. And some of these cities are thin, as you said. San Rafael, I believe, has about 450 employees. One of the things I don't hear being talked about, other than by myself a lot of times, and I'm usually the only one, is when we look at pensions and we look at the median or the average, significantly there's a large high end. And when we hear from employees, not a lot of those folks are making that. They're making that $60,000 to $70,000 a year pension. They're not making the $150,000 to $200,000 a year pension that are being paid to some of the higher levels. I did just a cursory search of some information, and in 2017, there are 40. I'm not picking on any one group here. There are 44 chief level officers in the county of Marin. For all city fire agencies, including the county of Marin, not including CAL FIRE or Parks, 44 chief level officers. That means battalion chiefs, deputy chiefs, and fire chiefs. 44, with total compensation in plus or minus 5 or 10%, about $13 million a year. Okay, we have a population in Marin County of about 256,000 people. We have 19 separate fire agencies. Alameda County has a population of around 1.6 million people. They have about 9 fire agencies. Contra Costa is about 1.4 million people. They have 8 or 9 fire agencies as well. Nobody's talking about consolidation. Nobody's talking about efficiencies because it's a political, kind of time bomb, or not even a time bomb, a bomb right in front of you that no one wants to address. That how can we say that we are being ultimately efficient when we have 6 fire stations along Sir Francis Drake that you can make within about 2 minutes of a drive, when we have 19 different fire agencies, and I haven't even mentioned the school districts. Okay, school districts are the same thing. When we had vacancies in San Rafael and the formerly known Dixie Miller Creek School District at the same time for superintendents, we didn't go and look and say, hey, let's consolidate these two districts and have one superintendent. No, we went out and hired two for $250,000 a year. I mean, Dixie has an interim right now, but they're in the process of looking one, and if you look at their previous pay, it's going to be about that same level. So why aren't we having those conversations as city councils? Because it's not political right now. You have to go and you have to look at that. But I say, and I will say it until as long as I'm on council, until they kick me off or I don't get reelected, that's what we need to be doing. Corte Madera and Larkspur did a great job at consolidating their fire and consolidating with their Central Marin Police, and that's good. But I think we can do that as a countywide level, and it's going to take people with the chutzpah to stand up and say we need to do this, because we don't need 19 separate fire agencies. We don't even need 19 different police agencies. What people care about is when someone shows up, it's not the patch on their shoulder, it's that they show up. Okay? And so when you look at that overall, and I know I'm getting long-winded on this, but it's something that we do need to look at, is that it's not firing people now. It's as people retire, as people, you know, through attrition, that you can reduce that overall cost. And at the higher end, you don't need 44 battalion level officers. Now, I'm going to be probably chastised a lot by people, but that's the way I see it. And I'm wondering if you guys looked into that, into your plan, about consolidation and efficiency. So long-winded to that question.
The answer is yes. It is in our report. And, you know, I go back to 2003, and one of the things I ran on was about getting better operational efficiencies through either shared services or consolidations. So one of the first assignments I picked up, you know, with the MCCMC is that, you know, we have a group that oversees JPAs. You know, Larkspur participates in about 30 to 35 joint services agreements, and a lot of them are with the other cities. But I think to John's point, it's kind of clipping at the edges, because it does provide you with some, you know, some of the benefits of being larger. But when you look at something like fire, absolutely, that's something that can be consolidated. What I'm hoping is that the new JPA that is being proposed with wildfire mitigations can be the beginning of some discussion of getting all our fire agencies working together. I think Ross Valley in particular has made some good steps in terms of having, I think, 5 or 6 different jurisdictions now part of Ross Valley Fire Protection District, and now Jason Weber, who's the county fire chief, is the fire chief for them as well. So the best time, as John mentioned, is that when there are positions that are open, that is when you start the discussion. But sometimes those discussions might not get either the political will of the people who are decision makers, or the, what I would say, fear and misperception of their own communities, where they feel that they're losing their own local control. So a lot of it has to do with messaging. A lot of times it's amazing. The employees are typically the ones who realize it early on. That was one of the things that allowed Central Marin Fire to be formed, is once we got the employees on board, it was easy to get the rest of the communities on board, and we had 2 open positions on both sides with a chief, and then it was just a matter of getting the paperwork done. Believe it or not, the single impediment was CalPERS, because they would not allow a new JPA to form and have a pension obligation without the individual cities being jointly and separately liable for their obligations.
I'm just going to make one more additional comment. So it's both political and it's financial. Okay. Had we thought about it, page 28 of our report, it's got a full page on that specific topic, including the savings that were specifically inured through the merger of Corte Madera and Larkspur and San Anselmo. So yes, that's there. When you do your 10-year plan, you look at these things. Mill Valley, for instance, has had a committee looking at this for a little bit of time. I think once you see the numbers, your motivation to look at all options becomes much larger. I said it's both political and financial also, because it's very tricky. If you are a full service city and you give up your fire and police to somebody else, you give up revenues also. So you got to make sure that when everything's all said and done that it's worked out. It's sophisticated, it's complicated, it's definitely worth doing, it's on the table, and it's something that's already been specifically dealt in the document. It's something we highlight within the document.
I'm Raleigh Katz with the Marin Association of Public Employees, union that represents the majority of Marin County employees. First, I appreciate the council members' remarks about consolidation. Firefighters Union has been advocating on the fire side. You mentioned Contra Costa on fire. And Contra Costa, the city of Richmond runs libraries. All other libraries are run by the county. Cities sometimes own the buildings, make contributions. There's one head librarian, not 19 or 20 or 25. Also, Dick, on the Social Security, the Medicare issue, I want to emphasize public sector employee retirees go into Medicare, and they go into either a supplemental or advantage, depending on what plan. And if the employer only pays X dollars a month, which is the case for a lot of Marin County retirees, that's what they get. And I believe the California rule, with all due respect, sir, says shall, not should. But we'll find out what the Supreme Court thinks soon. I'm looking up here, Social Security average benefit $1,461 a month, and I think I heard $300 or $400 a month for a 401k. And there's at least some uncurrent that that's what an acceptable retirement is. It absolutely is not. $30,000 a year you can't live on. And there seems to be an assumption that we need to bring people down rather than bring people up. And I'm not defending every pension decision. I've been on record as saying the reforms, the improvements at the end of the 90s were a mistake. But for the last 30 to 40 years, the working class in this country has been hollowed out. The middle class. And they became middle class because of labor unions and the New Deal and Social Security and real pensions. And I don't know what it's like in the boardroom about 401ks, but I can tell you what it's like for a lot of working people. You know, auto workers just went on strike for 5 weeks to try to reverse some of that. A 401k plan was never intended to be a pension. There are 3 stools of retirement: Social Security, pension, and savings. And 401ks are savings plans, and the more money you make, the more able you are to save. So to suggest that there's something wrong with the pension system because it doesn't pay what Social Security and 401k pays, with all due respect, is a completely wrong place to start. And that's not to say that there aren't issues about unfunded liability and these issues aren't real. And in terms of medical, we wouldn't be having any discussions about retiree medical if we didn't have an employer-based medical system in this country, unlike every other modern civilized country in the world. We wouldn't have it if we had some kind of universal health care provided for all citizens. So what is it? The average wage of most people in America has stayed flat for the last 35, 40 years. How much of the wealth in this country is owned by the top 1% or the top 1/10%? And so the answers to those long-term problems are not cutting pensions. And I appreciate the comment. There are a lot of people who make 50, 60, 70 grand a year and are going to get a pension of 45 or 50,000 without Social Security. I don't think that's a lot of money. I don't think that's living high on the hog. And people who make that kind of money aren't going to be able to stay in Marin. Thank you.
So can I reply to that? Because I've heard you say this on a number of venues. So my thought is that electeds have to solve problems. And we have an extended conversation about ways to raise revenues in here through various mechanisms. Those all involve a vote of the public, a vote of the people. So while I agree it's difficult to live on whatever the number is with regards to your Social Security and your 401k plan, that's what most people live on, right? Only 4% of America have an adequate pension, so they only live on their pension. So I don't have pixie dust to make everybody have, 10 times the amount of money we wish they have. We have to be realistic about the fact that many voters are going to have fatigue around the idea of supporting a benefit which is substantially different than the majority of Americans have. That's the problem. Okay, and you know, and the question is, and fundamentally the question is, because I feel a strong obligation to make sure that the people who work in my town get the promise that we give them. The question is, when we come to the table next time, will there be some flexibility? And there has been with regards to the willingness to take away the other post-employment benefit for new employees. I want to recognize that. But the truth of it is, we all have to work together to have a deep conversation about this. And maybe the employees would prefer current pay versus retirement benefits. We need to understand all those costs and have real conversations about them. I said all along, there's no good and bad. I'm not arguing anything's bad. I just look at the numbers and say, these are the numbers. We have to deal with what we've got.
I just had one follow-up question on the fix, which you say is to the current fix to not include new employees. Well, it's going to be 20 years before those employees retire. So in 20 years, it's too little, too late.
You get what you can get when you can get it.
That's not enough.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Sure. Thank you for the report. Thanks for coming out. I read the report. Very good. I appreciate it. The Larkspur solution with the bonds, municipal bonds. You were able to tap that market. I understand, and I appreciate that. If that wasn't available to you, let's say the municipal bond market was not possible, what were the alternative scenarios that you all looked at? Was it like a 20% cut to current wages and benefits? Was it across the board cuts across all of the major departments to your municipality? What were the alternatives? Because you guys have solved the problem with something that you wanted to do. The gentleman on the other side believes it's not a prudent thing to do. And I see both positions, but what were the other alternatives that were considered? And I once again want to say thanks for being here and thanks for what you guys are doing. Thank you.
I can only speak for Larkspur. You know, what we're trying to do is still maintain the same level of service at a reduced expense so that we can take the money that we save and put it into, like John had suggested, one mechanism is, you know, a Section 115 trust. But, you know, basically that is a way to prepay your current obligations so that they can start making money for you and you don't have a larger obligation later. Okay, and the way we do that is, to John's point, you know, we share battalion chief with San Rafael, for example. You know, every opportunity we can, we're looking for a place to save money and at the same time either keep the service level the same or to increase it. You know, John mentioned Central Marin Police, the only police authority in the state since 1980. Nobody else still does it. But yet, if you look at our cost over the last 10 years, if you don't take the increase in the benefits from the last couple years, our expenses have been flat on a nominal basis. So that means we're paying the same amount of money, not even inflation adjusted. So, and we've been able to put more police officers on the street. So, you know, now there's discussion about, we've had discussions about park and rec, we've had discussions about library, you know, fires all the time. We just entered into an agreement with Kentfield also. You know, so all those things, a little bit, we're saving tens of thousands of dollars here, sometimes low six figures, but all that allowed us to now start to make a contribution of about $400,000 into our rather than pay as you go, we're coming closer to our annual required contributions for the OPEB.
Two folks here are going to be recognized, but I just want to see if there's anybody who can't ask the question, kind of like this gentleman goes to the head of the line when you haven't asked one. So this gentleman on the aisle with his hand up, you'll be next, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll go to you.
And then real quickly, Mill Valley is literally doing it right now. That's the point. Until you know how big the hole is, you can't figure out what kind of pain you're going to endure. We measured our hole. It's in the report which came out, I don't know, about a month ago, okay? So we push out 10 years with a recession, and we know what our target is, and now we're going to do the heavy lifting. I will tell you that we saw this coming. We've already put $1.2 million away to fund our pension, to soften our pension. And of course, we're paying our full OPEB obligation. We have a $31 million gross obligation. We've already put in 10, so we're down to 21. So that's a very, you know, we're making that progress. But now the hard work happens, right? Because we're also dealing with the question of adding more staff in the fire area at the same time. So it's difficult, but until you figure out how big the hole is, you have no idea. Right? So that's why we're really trying to push everybody to go out and do this measurement to your individual specific situation so that there doesn't come a day when your controller opens the mail and gets a bill from PERS and says, I don't have enough money.
Yeah, and, you know, just, sorry, I just want to add one thing, you know, about, you know, labor and how they contribute to it, because our staff members are not willing to be in a box. Okay, the box being that this is what I was paid to do, this is my job description. You know, we fully cross-train everybody across different, you know, the same departments so that you can get economies of scale without having to hire people who are specialists. So every way that you can, and you know, we have a good relationship with our employees, so that helps. You know, I'm sure other cities do too. I don't know who does and who doesn't.
When I'm looking at the screen up here, I see down here the last statement. Yeah, okay. Thank you. I see the last statement that someone with $132,000 final pay will get $11,000. Well, how about the people that are getting $250,000 pay? Can this be capped?
It is capped.
It is?
Yeah, it's capped at 275.
So they're going to get $20-some thousand a month in benefits.
So the people who get angry about pension always focus on the top people. It's just a natural thing.
Yeah.
But in corporate America, there are very highly paid people also. I actually personally say if I have to hire a city manager, our city manager has announced he's leaving, I'm going to go into the marketplace and we need to find a new city manager. It's not going to be inexpensive. It's an important position. I think it's an emotional conversation. I think the really interesting thing, as I've said earlier, is look at the median person, what your median person makes, and it is not a lot of money. It's not like a median employee has got a reasonable job in the city is going to walk away with a huge amount of money. However, at the same time, someone on the corporate side is in a worse situation. They don't have even what the city's giving. I think it's just important. I think the focusing on the top is dramatic, makes people angry, but I'm more interested in the middle personally, for whatever that's worth.
I use CalPERS as a good example of underpaying your staff, because one of the things is, you know, firms I work with, the investment managers, well in the 6 figures, sometimes approaching 7 figures, especially the top portfolio managers that are, you know, managing, you know, $10, $15 billion. Okay, CalPERS is the largest public employee fund in the country, and yet their investment professionals are probably making around 200, the top ones around in the 200,000 range. You're not getting the best talent, and the pure admission of that is the fact that they decided to go to passive investing rather than to try and beat the market.
Using as an example the extraordinary number of administrators at the University of California system, you know, I think it's like over my lifetime, we've gone to a point where there's far more people in administration than teaching anyone. And so it's like this mission creep within bureaucracies. So the question that comes up to me is, has there been a serious look at the efficiency, and he's talking about efficiency by consolidation, but even before consolidation, is not the government doing or maybe involved in far too many things that are really unnecessary and that could actually be handed over to areas like volunteers and outsourced like a temporary basis instead of having this as part of a permanent expense structure.
Well, that's one of the things that is also in our report, and one of the things we noted was that a couple of years ago there was legislation that was introduced where municipal corporations were not able to outsource unless there was, I can't remember exactly the language it was, but effectively you have, if it's something that you already do, you can't outsource it effectively. Now that didn't pass because of some objections that were raised, but I understand that that's right back in committee again, and it will have another, they're going to take another crack at it.
And with regards to a comment about big versus small, if you look at the state government, I operate within the Cal system. I just teach my one class there, but I have a sense for how that system operates. You know, then you get down to a city. I had, I forget, about 300 employees in my group when I was managing my group. So I have a sense for how it feels to manage something like that. Our city, 150 people, I know most of them. They all work hard. I can just tell you, the smaller you get, the less inefficiency there is. I just don't feel there's much inefficiency in the small ones. And I know it's easy for us as taxpayers to get really grumpy about the big ones, and I think there probably is a reasonable reason for that, but at least as far as our small ones, our small 11 cities, I don't see much fat there, to be honest with you. They're hardworking people.
To your point on paying up for talent, whether it's CalPERS or city manager, one of my favorite quotes is, if you pay peanuts, then you get monkeys. So couldn't agree more. My question is, are there any districts, towns, municipalities that have smartly defeased CalPERS and opted out and are completely immunized, or is it not the case?
It's not going to happen. I mean, basically...
I know not now, but...
Well, and just like in corporate America, right? Corporate America, what happened in corporate America was everyone moved, they froze their plans, right? They quit putting more benefits into them. They let them run off. You know, this is in the 80s. They didn't say, okay, I want to buy annuities for my employees, because that is an option. You can go to a large life insurance company and buy an annuity. It's super expensive because the life insurance company is taking all that risk, both the mortality risk and the investment risk. They'll get paid for it. Just like PERS, when you exit PERS, what is it, like 3.5?
It's 3.5, yeah.
3.5%.
Yeah.
That is huge. It's just it's not doable. You can't do it. It's impossible. So we're in. We just have to run it out.
So let me just say lastly, I do manage pension funds globally. We are the laughingstock of most of the rest of the world. Canada, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, their assumed rate of return is, I think, between 4.5%. They're scrupulously 100% funded. All the teachers are guaranteed they're going to get paid. Taxpayers don't have to put in more. And so, Raleigh, the one thing I would say to you is the 7% is Madoff accounting. It's not sustainable. It's not going to last. And so you're doing your own members a disservice by making them believe that that is going to last. So that's the reality. Warren Buffett, any number of financial experts, Stanford, Bill Sharp, this is the math of it, unfortunately. It's just math. I don't disagree that people should be lifted up, but we also should use accurate accounting of the type that PricewaterhouseCoopers endorses.
All right. Anybody else that has a comment for that?
The city and county of San Diego a few years back put forth a ballot measure to the folks to vote on, to say with new employees to be offered a defined contribution program, and that passed overwhelmingly by the voters. I think it was like 70%. It was obviously since brought to court, and I believe recently the Supreme Court found in favor of the employees who sued, saying that they didn't bargain in good faith before putting that on the ballot, that a participant was the main participant in putting it on the ballot was a member of the city council or the mayor at the time, and that they had the duty to bargain in good faith. That being set aside, do you see that as a potential option for the go forward, where the folks that are currently in plans are guaranteed those. And I'm not asking, do we take anything away from the people that are currently in the plans, but that to a point of taking that funding there, completing that promise to those folks there, but every single new hire gets put into a defined contribution program, because it sounded like a good thought. The people that were in the plan got to keep their plan. The people that were hired new were under a new promise. So is that a feasible thing that San Diego tried? They obviously didn't do it the right way, it seems, but is that a feasible option in your guys' view?
My view is that if I was, the governor and I could change things myself, I would not be so. I'd be more aggressive. I would suggest that you'd do what corporate America did, and that you would freeze the promise. So if you're a 40-year-old and you've worked 20 years, that you would get that earned service, and then you would shift your future service to a 401k plan rather than having you run out the pension plan forever. You're suggesting that employee runs out the pension plan forever, and then the next person who comes from employment will do that. That's going to take like 60 years because most employment is very stable there. What happened in corporate America worked out because there was pressure. I mean, corporations need talented people. That's, it's important, and there was a way to make that happen. I would be more in favor. If we actually were to bite the bullet, we'd shift to a combined plan. But this is not, it's interesting to talk about it. And when you're sitting over there, it's really interesting. But when you're sitting over here, we have to pay the bills. So I'm just focused on paying the bills for the next 6-7 years, actually. But it's interesting conceptually. I also agree it's really interesting to talk about the rate, because I think the rate's too high. At least in Mill Valley, we did go to 6% for our OPEB obligation, despite putting money into CERBT and them running stochastic models that said should be 6.75. I convinced my fellow council members to lower it down to 6. So I said, hey, if we're wrong, what happens? We've got more money. That's okay. Let's pay that extra every year. Those are the kind of things we can operate on locally, and to make a decision to get rid of OPEBs for future employees, subject to reasonable negotiation and a great acceptance on the other side. So, there's not the other side, our employees. So, there's lots to do, but anyway, that's my feeling about that.
The advantage of raising your hand before 8 o'clock. So there was 3 up. You each have a chance for a question. I'm going to have this gentleman up here, and then I'm going to go down here, and Rob.
Mine will be quick. To that.
He can have my spot.
To that.
He can have my spot.
We started late, so we can go a few minutes late.
Referencing the 6% OPEB, do any cities say to themselves, this 7% is not going to work, let's assume 6 for pension benefits? Or do they just blindly?
Yeah, that's one of the 3 ways you can, we gave 3 options in terms of the way you can deal with the pension, right? One of it is to give it to PERS, and I'll try to be really quick about this. If you give it to PERS, it's gone forever. Okay. If you put into a 115 trust, it's locked specifically for pension-only uses, which means that if a bridge falls down and you need that money for something else, you can't get at it except to pay that 1 year's amount of requirement. So it has less flexibility in terms of taking the money away, but you can invest it at a higher rate. The third option is just have a designated fund inside of your city's balance sheet on your assets. That gives you greater flexibility, but with that, you have a much lower rate of return because of what I'd call the Orange County rule that says you can't invest in stupid stuff. You have to be very conservative with regards to how you generally invest. So those are the 3 solutions we laid out for several pages in our 80-page report. I can't evangelize for one of those 3 because each of them has pluses and minuses. But to answer your question, you can absolutely prepay. No, but you don't need to. You can just run the numbers. It's just an actuarial calculation. Yeah. It's no mystery. It's just math.
This is probably a comment, not a question. Closing funds it's not as easy as you might think. It can add to cost, but I would just say this. The notion that you just eliminate the benefit and have a worse benefit for new people may sound good, but it creates terrible inequities. You got people working side by side with a different package, and there were just auto workers who went on strike for 7 weeks because of that, including people who had the best deal out for that long, saying, this isn't right, the guy next to me doesn't make as much as I do, or doesn't have the same benefit as I do.
Yes. I'd just like to get a little bit of clarity about a term that you just used, outsourcing. Let's say hypothetically,
a fire chief retires and we depend on another municipality's fire chief to run our service, do you consider that outsourcing?
That's effectively what Ross Valley has done.
Okay, and you did say, if I want to I just want to be clear, you said that there's some sanction against outsourcing.
Well, the outsourcing more like to a third-party private entity.
To a third-party private entity. Okay, so for instance, if we wanted to outsource our safety service to another safety service, yes, whatever, that's legitimate and that's okay.
Yeah.
It is.
And, you know, to some degree, if Central Marin Fire can, not Central Marin Fire, if Central Marin Police can figure out a way to close that gap between San Anselmo and Corte Madera, that would be an opportunity I would like to see happen. So when you think about what's in between, you got Ross and you have County Marin Sheriffs.
Got it. Okay.
The outsourcing, the restriction on outsourcing is to go to a private enterprise. So for instance, if you took your finance function and all the related billing processes and all that and went to a private enterprise that provide that service, I believe that's what's not allowed.
Got it.
Right. So as long as the person providing the services is still getting the benefits of the public sector, there's be no objection to it.
No harm, no foul.
As I understand it.
Very good. Thank you.
8 o'clock, we'll all turn into hungry people. The room, but we want to thank, first of all, the city of Centerville and Councilman John Gamble for making this possible and tonight.
Obviously. Our two panelists, John McCauley and Larry Chu, thank you. And also thank the mayors and councilmen of Marin County, because the council members have stood up and authorized this and have really been the sponsors. That's not the county. That's the council members of the 55 council members of the 11 municipalities. They should be thanked. And Jody and the Citizens for Pension Reform. If it wasn't for that organization, this would be not a topic of conversation in this county. And by the way, there's an election happening very shortly and in the next year. And so you might want to think about raising some of these points raised tonight, some of those folks running for election. So everybody have a nice night. Happy Halloween.